I've spent a fair bit of time in Africa over the last 25 years. I've worked in Botswana, Malawi, Zambia, Nigeria and Morocco. And to be fair, I feel perfectly safe virtually everywhere I go in any part of Africa, the countries I've worked in and the countries I've travelled in, which also includes South Africa, Zimbabwe and a few other countries. And I never feel any fear wandering around on the streets, in the bars, just basically wherever I go, I feel safe. I have no real fear of disease or illness. There's good medical facilities, good doctors, not as good as Europe or North America, admittedly, but if you've got a basic ailment, you can be well treated and you'll be all right. In fact, in the case of something like malaria, I'd be far happier to have malaria in Africa, where it's something that doctors are very familiar with recognising and treating, than in Europe, where you may be misdiagnosed. In terms of personal safety, I don't think that it's much different to walking around the streets of Lusaka, Lilongwe or Gaborone than it would be walking around Manchester, Liverpool or London. There'll be some risks, but no more so. I was perhaps a little bit more cautious when I lived in Port Harcourt in Nigeria, but even there I drove around, I wandered through the markets and I never found any problems. I was just a little bit more cautious because of some of the stories you hear, but they were second-hand. My first-hand experience was good. There is one thing though that I am more fearful of when I'm in Africa than when I'm in other parts of the world. And that is road traffic accidents. I remember just before I went to Botswana, just after the turn of the millennium, and before I went for some training with some of the other people I was going out to work with and the teacher for Botswana recruitment scheme. We had a residential weekend, and on that weekend, we had a few lectures about what to expect in terms of life in Botswana. And one thing struck me, and that when they said to about 25 of us who were at the conference, they said, statistically, the chances are that one of you may well die in a road traffic accident. And that struck me. That really did hit home. But I was like, yeah, that's not really going to happen. We're going to be cautious. Yeah, we're not going to be taking risks. You know, when you're a foreigner, you're going to be a bit cautious in the beginning particularly. But within the first year, one of the guys who went out with us was killed in a road crash. The prophecy came true. And the longer that I've been working and travelling and living in Africa, what I've come to realise is there are a number of factors that do make the roads more dangerous. Now, the first one is the state of the roads. The roads are nowhere near as good as they are in Europe or North America. There are far more potholes and the roads are just not looked after as well as they are. The infrastructure could do with considerable improvement. And that includes when you're taking long distance journeys between major cities. Some of the roads are really in a dire state. Secondly, is the state of the cars. Inevitably, there are fewer new cars and a lot more second-hand cars and quite old cars which have been imported, many from the Far East, and aren't always in the best state of repair. So the cars themselves can be more hazardous than cars which you frequently find in other parts of the world. And thirdly is the drivers. Now, African drivers are no better or no worse than drivers in other parts of the world. However, laws are not as well enforced, perhaps one might say, in certain parts of Africa than they are in other parts of the world. And particularly when one thinks about drink driving or driving under the influence, as they'd say in the United States. It is common for people to drive from bar to bar while consuming essentially vast quantities of alcohol. And I found that to be the case in Zambia and Malawi particularly. And whereas driving under the influence or drink driving is a cultural taboo these days in many countries in the Northern Hemisphere, it's not really considered that way across much of Africa. And it is a societal norm to drive after taking a few beers or even spirits. And there's a common joke in Zambia along the lines of, you can tell if someone is a drunk driver by the fact that they will drive in a straight line. Because when someone is sober, they will be moving from side to side, driving in a zigzag fashion to avoid the potholes. So when you take into account the fact that many of the roads are in disrepair, many of the cars have seen better days, and quite often people are driving under the influence, you've got three factors which mean that driving or being a passenger in a car can be a very hazardous occupation in Africa. And particularly, for obvious reasons, when driving at night. Not all cars or trucks will necessarily have lights. And sometimes, and I've heard of friends tell me that people they have known have been killed when they've driven into the back of a truck because the truck had no lights and was parked on the side of the road. Similarly, when trucks are trying to go up steep hills and have no lights, again, cars can run into the back of them and you're going to be killed. Now, of course, when I'm in Africa, I will drive and I'll be aware of the dangers. But again, it's part of life. We all take risks. You just want to minimise the risks. Always wear a seatbelt. Now, I must stress that because I wouldn't be here today and my eldest son wouldn't be with us today if we hadn't have been wearing seatbelts one time when we were driving between the long way in Malawi and Lusaka, Zambia. An incredibly long trip, over 1,000 kilometres, and probably foolishly I tried to do it in one go, a bit tired, and when I had a blowout I was unable to control my vehicle. It rolled several times and I ended up in a ditch. Fortunately, just had cuts and bruises, and the same with my little boy, who was only about 10 at the time. We were very lucky. Not everyone is. So, if you're taking a trip to Africa, just be aware of the dangers of the roads. You probably don't have to worry about the rest of the stuff. You don't have to worry about the media stereotypes, but do take care on the roads.